The real warning was never the number. The real warning was the moment Trump attached 2-3 weeks to bridges and electric power plants, because that is not how a leader talks when a war is simply winding down. That is how a leader talks when he wants the public to hear a countdown, while the planners hear permission. And then the theory turned into a precedent. The B1 bridge between Tehran and Karaj, a newly constructed route that was supposed to open to traffic this year, was already hit, with Iranian state media saying 8 people were killed and 95 wounded. Once a future public artery becomes part of the message, the war is no longer speaking only to bunkers and missile crews. It is speaking to a society circulation. This was not cosmetic damage, and it was not a symbolic graze. There was a clear breach in the road structure connecting Tehran and Karaj, which means the point was interruption as much as destruction. The second a war starts, communicating through broken routes, you are watching it move from battlefield punishment towards system pressure. If you want the version of this story that hits harder than the press conference, subscribe now. And drop your read in the comments before we go further. Because this entire video turns on one question. When you heard 2-3 weeks, did you hear an exit plan? Or did you hear the clock start on infrastructure warfare? Here is the answer. And it is ugly. 2-3 weeks does not primarily function as a peace promise. It functions as a political window, short enough to calm the public, flexible enough to threaten harsher targets, and vague enough to let the mission change shape without forcing a clean confession that it is changing. That is why this title pulls people in so hard. They can feel the contradiction before they can explain it. A short timeline sounds like de-escalation, but bridges and power plants belong to a completely different vocabulary. The vocabulary of making a country feel itself, being squeezed through the systems it depends on every hour of the day. And once those two things appear in the same breath, the sentence splits in half. One half is for the audience at home. Don't panic, this won't last forever. The other half is for Tehran. You still have a narrow window before the target list gets uglier, and the pressure starts leaning more openly on the things that keep normal life standing. Now comes the justification layer. Because every escalation needs one. The bridge is being framed as part of a planned military supply route for Iran's ballistic, missile, and attack drone force, which is exactly the kind of argument that can turn a public structure into a military node overnight. If that claim is solid, the strike becomes a precedent. If it is not fully proven, then a bridge ordinary people were supposed to drive across just became the rehearsal for normalizing a much darker category of targets. That is the trap. Modern war rarely says, we are moving closer to civilian state pressure. It says the target was dual use. It says the site contributed to military sustainment. It says the enemy left no alternative. And by the time the public finishes arguing about one bridge, the language needed to discuss the next bridge, then the next power station, is already sitting there waiting to be used. So the B1 bridge matters for more than the strike itself. It matters because it teaches the audience how the next phase will be sold. Not as a moral leap, not as a new doctrine, but as the logical extension of something already underway. One more step justified by logistics. One more target folded into necessity. And that is exactly why 2-3 weeks is so politically useful. It keeps the escalation sounding temporary. It tells the public that any hard move now belongs to the final chapter, not the opening of a new one. Temporary language has saved many wars from early backlash, right up until the moment temporary becomes the longest lie in the room. Trump told the country that core strategic objectives were nearing completion. That line should have narrowed the emotional horizon. Instead, it widened it. Because if the mission is truly near completion, then publicly preparing the audience for bridges and electric power plants makes no sense as closure language. It makes sense only if nearing completion is being used to lower resistance while harder leverage remains available. That is the hidden architecture of the phrase. If you say the mission is almost done, people assume the war is contracting. They do not instinctively ask whether almost done is the exact moment a government is most tempted to reach for one final burst of coercion before declaring success. But that final burst is often the most revealing part of the whole campaign. It tells you what the leadership thinks the enemy still has left psychologically, politically, and materially, and if what is left can only be broken by threatening movement, electricity, and state function, then the war has already drifted far beyond the cleaner language used to launch it. This is where many scripts go soft and start sounding like policy seminars. Let's not do that. The blunt version is simpler. If you need bridges and power plants on the table, then whatever you have already destroyed was not enough to force the outcome you wanted. And once that becomes true, The clock changes meaning. It stops being how long until peace and becomes how long until they decide whether to cross another line. That is why the audience clicked. Not to hear that war is complicated, but to hear what the sentence is doing underneath the sentence. After the speech, the most important question was still unanswered. What exactly does victory even look like? That vacuum matters more than the rhetoric around it, because when the end state is blurry, the target list becomes elastic. And when the target list becomes elastic, almost anything can be sold as the final necessary step. Undefined wars are the ones that stretch while calling themselves short. They keep borrowing public patience against the promise that the finish line is close, even when no one can clearly describe what standing at that finish line would actually mean. That is how 1 more week becomes 2 more weeks, and 2 more weeks becomes a license for 1 more escalation. So ask the question the speech did not answer. If the core objectives are nearly complete, what still needs to happen badly enough that bridges and power infrastructure must now enter the public conversation? You do not need a classified briefing to understand what that implies. It implies force alone has not yet produced the political effect required, and once political effect becomes a missing ingredient, infrastructure starts looking tempting. Because infrastructure does not just hurt a military, it hurts confidence, mobility, industry, recovery, and the felt texture of normal life. It tells a government that resistance will not only cost it weapons, it may cost it the ability to keep the nation functioning without fear seeping into everything. That is why this story is more dangerous than it first appears. A missile site is a military story. A bridge is a national function story. A power plant is an every household story. When those categories begin to overlap, the war starts pushing itself into the place where strategic pressure and civilian dependence can no longer be neatly separated. Iran's response made the next danger impossible to miss. It warned that if its power plants and infrastructure are targeted, vital infrastructure, energy, and oil infrastructure across the region would become legitimate targets and be irreversibly destroyed. That means the second this war fully enters infrastructure coercion, it stops being a contained strike campaign and starts looking like a regional systems war. That phrase matters. Systems war. Because the point is no longer just who can hit whom. The point becomes which societies can still move, cool, pump, desalinate, ensure, and reassure their populations, while the pressure spreads from bases and depots into the skeleton underneath daily life. And that is why this title is not exaggeration. It is compression. Bridges and power plants are next does not mean every such target will be hit in a neat linear sequence. It means those categories have now entered the war's spoken logic. And once they are in the logic, they are in play as threat, precedent, bargaining weapon, or actual target. That changes how every neighboring state hears this conflict. Gulf capitals do not hear a threat against Iranian power plants as a distant bilateral matter. They hear the possibility that their own grids, water systems, export terminals, or transport corridors could be pulled into a retaliatory chain if the war leans too hard on Iranian infrastructure. And that is where the 2-3 weeks line starts to look even more cynical, because while the public hears a short runway, the region hears a warning that the runway could be used to test how much broader infrastructure pressure can be applied. Before the whole map starts shaking, the coldest audience in the world translated the speech immediately. As soon as Trump finished speaking, Brent crude jumped 5% to $106 a barrel because markets heard what official language tried to soften. No clean end state, no clear closure mechanism, and more pressure hanging over the systems that keep energy and transport stable. Money does not wait for think tank essays when the war starts sounding like utility disruption. And that price move matters because markets are not reacting to one bridge in isolation. They are reacting to sequence of bridge strike, harder rhetoric, threats against power infrastructure, no clear finish line, retaliation warnings. That sequence tells traders, shippers, and governments that the danger is no longer confined to direct battlefield exchanges. Once that happens, the war starts exporting its fear into fuel costs, into shipping, insurance, into supply chains, into the sense that even if no missile lands near you, the infrastructure logic of the conflict can still reach into your economy and make itself felt by households that have never heard of courage. This is why leaders love short timelines in messy wars. A short timeline can carry pain politically. People tolerate shocks if they believe there is a near end. But if that short timeline is really just a container for a harsher target phase, then the public is not being prepared for peace. It is being conditioned to endure one last and possibly decisive escalation. And when you realize that the line lands differently, 2-3 weeks stops sounding like relief delayed. It starts sounding like the amount of time Washington thinks it may need to make the threat against infrastructure either credible enough to work or real enough to bite. Then there is the ceasefire story, and it sits right at the center of the information war. Trump said Iran wanted a ceasefire. Iran denied asking for any ceasefire at all. That clash is not a detail. It is a battle over whether the world sees Tehran as already bending under pressure or still refusing to submit, while the target list gets darker. Because once the image of a begging adversary takes hold, the rest writes itself. Harder threats look like the final squeeze before a deal. Civilian-adjacent pressure looks like unpleasant necessity. The timeline sounds vindicated. The leader sounds in control. But if Iran successfully denies that image, then the same threats look different. They stop looking like the cleanup before surrender and start looking like the front edge of another escalation cycle. Same words, different strategic meaning. That is why both sides are fighting so hard over who asked for what. And this is where most public debate gets played. People argue over which side is lying. The deeper question is which side benefits from making the claim. Now Trump benefits from implying Tehran is already looking for relief. Tehran benefits from projecting refusal, and the audience should notice that this fight over perception is happening at the exact same moment bridges and power plants enter the threat language. That overlap is not random. It is the mechanism. One narrative says the enemy is weakening, so harder pressure will end this fast. The other says the enemy is inventing weakness, so harder pressure proves the war is expanding. That is the gap where the truth of the title lives. And underneath all that rhetoric sits a forced posture that does not naturally match the soothing version of the story. The aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush is headed toward the Middle East with 3 destroyers, and thousands from the 82nd Airborne Division have also begun arriving. That may serve deterrence, contingency planning, or signaling, but it does not feel like a war already exhaling into final calm. You do not need to panic at that fact to understand its meaning. A government can prepare options while publicly talking about closure. In fact, it almost has to if it wants to preserve freedom of action while still selling the war as controlled. But for the audience, the takeaway is brutal. The rhetoric of nearing completion does not erase the machinery of escalation still being positioned in the background. So now the title can be answered cleanly. What does Trump's 2-3 weeks really mean? It means one of two hard things, and neither is comforting. Either it is a real short runway to the end of U.S. involvement, in which case it is being used to cover a final burst of coercion against infrastructure-linked targets before declaring success, or it is not a real runway at all, in which case it is anesthesia for escalation. And notice what does not change between those two possibilities. The bridge still got hit. The next targets were still publicly named. Iran still threatened regional infrastructure in response. The ceasefire claim remains contested. The end state remains vague. The force posture remains active. In both versions of reality, the category of war being prepared for the public is darker than the phrase 2-3 weeks makes it sound. That is why the most revealing part of the title is not the countdown. It is the list attached to the countdown. Clocks are political. Target lists are confessional. They tell you what kind of leverage a leadership still thinks it may need. And once bridges and power plants enter that list, the story is no longer just about stopping what Iran can launch. It becomes about threatening what Iran needs to keep society functioning under pressure. That is not a small rhetorical shift. That is the point where a war starts talking less like counterforce and more like compellence through systemic pain. If Trump really means to leave within that window, then those weeks may be the last chance to break resistance before exit. If he does not, then the phrase was never really about peace in the first place. Either way, the same conclusion survives the argument. 2-3 weeks was not the safe part of the sentence. It was the cover for the unsafe part. That is why the image of the B-1 bridge keeps coming back and refuses to leave the story. It was not just a structure. It was a route, a future convenience, a piece of planned normal life, and it was ripped open before it could fully serve that purpose. Once a war starts making examples out of things like that, you are already beyond the clean, early language version of the campaign. So no, the most important question was never whether Trump literally has a calendar on his desk marked for the end of the war. The real question is what he is trying to make possible inside that calendar window. And the answer, staring straight out of his own target language, is that infrastructure has moved closer to center stage. That is the hard truth a lot of official phrasing is designed to blur. The war may still be sold as limited in time, but its logic is pushing toward the systems that make a country livable. And the second that becomes the logic, everybody in the region starts living under a wider threat than the headline alone admits. So if you remember one thing from this video, remember this. 2-3 weeks was never reassuring on its own. Not once bridges and power plants were attached to it. At that point, it became something else entirely. A warning period before the war could start speaking through the arteries of civilian life. And that is when the countdown stops measuring time and starts measuring how close the next line is to being crossed. Stay here, because this channel follows the part of the story that officials phrase softly right before it turns brutal.